The Devil's Interval. The dream was dead, suffocated in its crib before it had even learned to crawl. The official wake was held in a pub, where Ozzy and Bill Ward proceeded to get absolutely, monumentally loaded. Bill was on his usual poison, that lethal, farm-brewed paint stripper they called Scrumpy, mixed with a splash of blackcurrant juice to make it look less like piss and more like a Ponzi cocktail. When you had a few pints of that stuff, it wasn't like being drunk, it was like sustaining a deliberate head injury. Ozzy was so visibly devastated that when he got home, his old man, a man who watched every penny and was usually crying over unpaid bills, took one look at his son's face, said nothing, and just pressed a 10-bob note into his hand for more beer money. It was the financial equivalent of a state funeral. His dad tried to be encouraging, suggesting there would be other guitarists. He was a good bloke, the old man. He was also completely fucking wrong. There was only one Tony Iommi. Meanwhile, Tony was off living the high life, having a little holiday in the world of actual, proper rock stardom with Jethro Tull. He got to stand on a stage in London with John Lennon and Eric Clapton. He was in a band that people had actually heard of. It was everything they had ever dreamed of. And he fucking hated it. He traded his gang of broke, miserable mates for a bloke who played the flute while standing on one leg like a deranged flamingo. He discovered a terrible truth: being a successful musician was an actual job. They had schedules. They had lengthy, organized rehearsals. There was a distinct lack of chaos, pub brawls, and dodgy vans. It was all terribly professional, and for Tony, it was about as much fun as filing a tax return. A few days before Christmas, he called an emergency meeting at the pub. The drinks were on him. Deezer and Ozzy, full of suspicion and heartbreak, demanded an explanation. How could playing a gig with John Lennon not be his scene? Tony's answer was simple. He explained that he didn't want to be someone else's employee. It just wasn't a laugh. It wasn't like being with them. Bill Ward, who was several pints deep into his cider and blackcurrant head injury, looked like he was about to burst into tears of pure, unadulterated joy. Geezer tried, and failed, to hide a massive grin. The band was back together. But Tony's return came with new terms and conditions. He had seen how the professionals worked, and he was bringing that discipline back to his gang of fuck-ups. He laid down the law. From now on, they would rehearse relentlessly. They would stop fucking around. And most importantly, they would focus on writing their own, original songs. It was the only way they would ever make a name for themselves. The man who had just quit one of the most professional bands in England had returned with a new mission: to whip his own chaotic, dysfunctional band into shape. It was the best bad idea they'd all had yet. The band was back together, armed with a new, serious work ethic courtesy of Tony's brief holiday in the land of professionalism. His first order of business was that they had to stop playing blues covers and start writing their own bloody songs. The question was, what the hell would a band of 4 miserable, broke blokes from the greyest city in England write about? Sunshine and pretty girls? It seemed unlikely. The answer, like all of the band's best ideas, came from a moment of profound, cynical observation. One day, during a rehearsal break at their shitty community centre, Tony looked out the window at the cinema across the street. There was a massive queue snaking all the way around the corner. It wasn't for a comedy or a romance. It was for a horror film. And right there, the light bulb went on. Tony, ever the pragmatist, had a revelation. Why were they busting their asses trying to make people dance, when it was perfectly obvious that what people really wanted was to pay good money to shit their pants in terror? He came into the next rehearsal with a riff. It wasn't a blues riff. It wasn't rock and roll. It just sounded wrong. It was heavy, menacing, and crawled under your skin like a spider. It was the musical equivalent of finding a severed finger in your bag of chips. Turns out, the riff was built around something called the Devil's Interval, combination of notes so famously evil that priests in the Middle Ages had apparently banned it from church music, probably thinking it would make the organ explode or summon a goat with a serious attitude problem. It was the sound of pure dread. And Geezer, the band's quiet, bookish librarian of doom, had the perfect words to go with it. He started scribbling lyrics that weren't about his baby leaving him or his Chevy breaking down. They were about a dark, shadowy figure appearing at the foot of his bed, lakes of fire, and all the other cheerful subjects he was reading about in his occult books. It was a perfect marriage of a riff that sounded like a warning and lyrics that described what you were being warned about. They called it Black Sabbath. They couldn't wait to unleash it on an unsuspecting audience. The next time they had a gig, they opened with it. The sound of a thunderstorm and a tolling bell filled the room, followed by Tony's monstrous, lurching riff. The audience just stood there, confused. They'd come to hear some blues, and instead they were getting the soundtrack to their own damn funeral. As Ozzy moaned out the terrifying lyrics, a wave of panic rippled through the crowd. Then, the girls started screaming, not screaming with delight, like they did for the Beatles, but screaming in actual, genuine terror, and ran for the fucking exits. For any other band, a stampede of women fleeing the venue would be a sign that you had fucked up badly. For them, it was a standing ovation. It was proof of concept. They had set out to make scary music, and the screams were their 5-star review. In that moment, they knew they were onto something. They weren't a blues band anymore. They were something else entirely. The band now had its secret weapon, a sound that could curdle milk at 50 paces and lyrics that could make a priest faint. There was just one problem. They were still saddled with a name that sounded like a fucking hippie gardening collective, Earth. It was a complete mismatch. Unleashing a song like Black Sabbath under the name Earth was like putting a shark in a petting zoo. It was confusing, misleading, and someone was bound to get hurt. The final nail in the coffin for their crap name came, as most things did, in the form of a public humiliation. They turned up for a gig somewhere near Manchester, ready to unleash their unique brand of sonic horror on the unsuspecting locals. As they sound-checked, with Tony grinding out the opening riff of their signature song, the venue manager, a bloke in a suit with a permanently worried expression, came running onto the stage, waving his arms like he was trying to land a plane. He was in a full-blown panic. He explained, through a series of pained splutters, that there had been a terrible mistake. He had booked a band called Earth. But he'd been expecting the other Earth, a cheerful little pop and Motown covers band that was also knocking about the C-list circuit. He thought he was getting California Dre. Instead, he got the soundtrack to a public execution. It was like booking a bouncy castle for a children's party and having a tank show up instead. He gave them 20 quid for their trouble and told them, in no uncertain terms, to fuck off. On the long, silent, and deeply embarrassing drive back to Birmingham, the decision was made. The name had to die. It wasn't just a bad name, it was a professional liability. The solution, mercifully, was staring them right in the face, written on their own set list. If they were going to write music that sounded like a horror film, they might as well be named after one. Earth was dead. Black Sabbath was born. The final, crucial piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place. They now had the members, the sound, and the perfect, menacing name to go with it. With the perfect, menacing name now in place, the final piece of the puzzle was to actually get someone to pay them for the racket they were making. This is the point in any band's story where the raw, chaotic energy of creation crashes headfirst into the cold, hard reality of the music business. And for Black Sabbath, The collision was as clumsy and accidental as everything else they'd ever done. Their first brush with the industry came in the form of a man who wanted to sign them to a record label. He'd heard their sludgy, heavy blues and decided they were, in his words, a great little blues band. His first brilliant idea for this terrifying new force in music, this harbinger of sonic doom, was for them to record a cover version. It was like discovering a fire-breathing dragon and immediately asking it to perform a puppet show. The band, desperate for a break, reluctantly agreed to record a version of a song called Evil Woman, making the guitars a bit heavier to try and hide the taste of selling out. The single was released and promptly went down like a concrete turd. But it did achieve one monumental success. It was played on BBC Radio 1. Once. At 6 o'clock in the morning. For Ozzy, this was the pinnacle of human achievement. He was up at 5, necking cups of tea, his nerves shot to hell. The thought that his own voice might actually come out of the radio was too much to handle. And then it happened. The sound of their raw, bludgeoning riff tore through the crackle of the morning broadcast. It's impossible to describe the feeling. For that one moment, it didn't matter that the only other people in the country who were listening were probably milkmen, insomniacs, and the odd, very depressed farmer. He ran around the house screaming his head off until his mum told him to shut the fuck up. He had made it. The record label, despite the single's failure, decided to roll the dice on a full album. This is where most bands would spend months agonizing over every detail. Black Sabbath were given 12 hours. That was it. One day in a London studio to capture their entire sound before they had to fuck off to a gig in Zurich. They didn't have time for artistic temperament or weeks of overdubs. They basically just set up their gear as if they were playing in a pub, blasted through their live set, double-tracked a few bits, and were out the door in time for last orders. The album that would define a genre was recorded in less time than it takes most people to assemble a piece of IKEA furniture. They had so little input that they didn't even see the album cover until it was finished. The record company, presumably sensing the dark energy of the music, had commissioned a genuinely spooky photograph of a creepy-looking watermill and a ghostly woman in black robes. They'd even put a massive, inverted cross on the inside of the gatefold sleeve. Most bands would have thrown a fit about the lack of consultation. Black Sabbath just looked at it and thought it was fucking brilliant. The record company had accidentally understood them better than they understood themselves. When the album was finally released on Friday the 13th of February, 1970, the band felt like they had been born. The critics, however, thought it should have been aborted. The reviews were horrendous. Lester Bangs, writing for Rolling Stone, basically called them a shit, simple-minded version of Cream, using words like claptrap and wooden. But being hated by the establishment, by the clever college kids who wrote for the magazines, was the ultimate validation. It was a badge of honor. It proved they were doing something right. And besides, while the critics were busy stroking their chins and writing them off, the actual kids were out buying the record. It smashed into the charts in Britain and America. The so-called experts didn't get it, but the teenagers in grey, industrial towns just like their own understood it perfectly. The business of chaos had officially begun.